music, but he gives us the notes.
Okay, maybe I should. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon or evening. It is January the 30th, 2022, and this is the first meeting of the year for the Legal Contracts and Board Policy Committee. And so we'll start the committee off with the previous meeting minutes, the summary from 22 November of 2022. Heidi, do you want to give us the updates?
Well, the last meeting we discussed.
Oh, can you use the mic just so that people can hear?
Right. The last meeting, we discussed 6 different policies that went for a first reading. 2 of them are going for a second reading today, and the others will need looked at a little more and need a little bit more of an update. And then after, that was pretty much the entire last meeting, was the 6 policies.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Any questions about our last meeting?
Just as a reminder, Dr. Akbar, we're in the middle of trying to review most all of our policies, the Neola updates. So we had Neola come in who did a look at our current policies and made some recommendations about a few of them that have been updated in other districts since ours have. So that's where those 6 came from. They were a part of a batch of Neola updates.
Thank you. No worries. We have quite a bit of policies that need review, so this committee will be full of work this year. So moving on, we're going to go to our second item here, which are discussion topics, which there's 2 for the second reading. So first we'll discuss the diploma deferral, policy 5460.1 or 01. Any questions, comments, or otherwise red lines or that anyone has for this policy? And this policy update did come from Neola. The other thing is when I talked to Diana Feidel about all of the different, the 6 policies from last meeting, the last meeting and the 2 that we have on the docket for today, this policy specifically was a new policy for our register, but not new to what we've been doing. So this is really bringing a policy in line with how we've operated. And she's stuck in traffic, so she'll be here as soon as she can. So I wanted to relay that. Any questions? Comments? Are we ready to move it forward to the full board for a third reading? Third and final reading? Yes? Okay, just want to make sure there's no concerns. All right, Dr. Hall? Oh. Okay. So with that being said, I think we're good with this policy to move it forward to the board, to the full board meeting for a third and final reading for diploma deferrals, which basically is supporting our students with IEPs who may need to be in classes or have some type of transition plan until their age of 22, and being able to participate still in the graduation program ceremony, even without obtaining their official diploma, with everyone else that's their age. And so that will move forward to our next meeting. The next policy for second reading is the policy 7440.03, small unmanned aircraft systems policy. This is an updated policy from Neola, and we have two options. Option 2 is the one that's being suggested. So any comments, questions, or red lines for this policy? Okay, so basically this is one that's basically prohibits any unmanned aircraft flying on our property or any of our buildings that we own. And basically that also includes drones. So just in case there were any questions about what the policy was.
I do have.
Yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I interrupted you.
No, I'm good.
Oh, okay. My question is, how does this apply to skyrights? So does the you know how if you're in the sky, like if it's a drone, yeah, so you know how it may not be ownership, like is that a loophole that people can get around? Because if they don't own the sky rights and I'm doing an aerial view, and you know some zoom ins can happen from an aerial view where I'm not necessarily touched down, like I'm not on the roof of your property, I'm not on the grass area on your property, but I'm within the sky right. Is that something?
I mean, I just know that you know there is a limit to your point as far as how high up in the air your rights extend. I couldn't tell you what that limit is off the top of my head, but such a limit does exist. So
I'm just curious because if you're seeing drones, if I'm flying a drone, like I can still possibly have footage of your property and what's transpiring on that property from a certain aerial view.
yeah, I think the way this policy is written is that it looks at the physical position of the drone, and the physical position of the drone cannot be within the limits of our property. But to your point, they could be much higher up
And still capturing everything. Okay.
Yeah.
So the one question I asked about it was, what is this really about? And part of it has to do with like sports. Oh Lord, I'm not a sports person, so what are games? I'm sorry, why did I blank on that word? Sports games and people basically recording and getting footage of sports in an unauthorized fashion. That was one of the things, and then the other one was had to do with inside the building. So I don't know if Madam Superintendent has anything else, but that's the essence of my understanding prior to this meeting.
I agree.
Okay, so are we prepared to move this forward to the full board for the third and final reading? Any objections? Okay, so it would be recommendation from this committee to bring forth the policy 7440.03, small unmanned aircraft systems, for third and final reading at our next meeting, based off the recommendation of this committee. So with that being said, as Ms. Moika mentioned, the other policies that we reviewed at our last meeting are still under works. The one thing we probably need to do is at least still keep it on the agenda, even because it's already come for first reading. And so, but they're still under works, being reviewed, and we'll get the official second reading after they are reviewed. So we might get them, in tandem or in separate, different times. With that being said, there's no other policy discussions for readings to come before this board. We do have a discussion of priorities next. And so as we discuss with this committee, we have, many policies in our district that need to be updated and reviewed, as well as some that we may deem necessary from the board's behalf. And so one of the ones that were being reviewed at the last meeting was transportation. And so I worked to put 3 different ones that we may want to discuss this year. Transportation, and this may or may not be a policy, may or may not be a part of our policy, but one of the things that I want us to look at, and this might be something we refer to the equity committee, but the transportation to Miller South, I know I've had a lot of parents contact me in the last 2 years asking about Miller South and their kids not being able to get transportation that they can't afford to get their kids there, and I think that's something we should look into. And so that may not be a policy, that may be just a discussion that we refer over to the equity committee that can work with the DEB folk and folks about how we make those decisions and how might we make that more of an equitable process for our students. Yes.
Would it be acceptable too if we also broaden that and thought about specialty schools? Because I think we also get that from NIFSTEM as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay.
Definitely. I think that's a good idea. And one of the things that I know we're not talking about LTOP now, but one of the things that I thought about, and I know we talked about a few years ago, is with the growth in the North Cluster, the STEM schools, both middle school and high school, could be an attractive option that we can ramp up in the district for students who live in that cluster specifically to ease some of the tension and overcrowding in those buildings. So, yes, I think broadening that discussion makes perfect sense. And Diana just walked in, so thank you for being here. You can come join us at the table. I told them you were stuck in traffic, so they knew you were coming. The next item that, again, these are just 3 that I put forward. What I thought we would do is maybe have some brief discussions about the need for these 3 and then open it up to see if there's any other needs that we have to discuss for the year. From there, I want us to think about them as priorities, rating them as high, moderate, or low, and then Todd and I, or someone and I, maybe it's Heidi and I, will work through that and try to determine a schedule that for when we can discuss them throughout the year, so that we're not bottlenecking on policies, but then also that we kind of all have that communication around what our priorities are for the year. So cell phone policy, as we all know, has been something we've gotten a few emails about and have heard from community members and some staff members about. And so I thought that would be one that we would take up this year as well. Any discussion on adding cell phone policy to our priorities for the year? Dr. Hall?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Committee Chair, Dr. Akbar. I think as we think through the things that we think can have the most impact on what happens like right now in our schools, right? And there are a lot of things from a policy standpoint that maybe we engage in that maybe take time to have a result in the school, but the cell phone policy is one of the things that we know that can have a direct impact like right now. I know that we had some district staff that traveled to Dayton, as I recall, last week to explore, or really to observe and explore a new technology that would employ that would include utilizing bags to put cell phones in that students would keep with them at all times, if you will. But the bags would sort of blunt the signal, and the phones become essentially useless, right? And so I know that That's something that, as we think from a policy standpoint, if we're looking at that kind of solution, for example, it would require that we'd have to go back and review our policies on that particular topic to ensure that we're incorporating a new procedure for how we roll out that bag system if that's the direction that the board elects to go in. But yeah, I mean, I think it's integral. I know some of us walk through the schools. It's regular feedback that we hear from the teachers, and you see it too when you walk down. You don't have to hear from the teachers. You just watch you watch the students in the classrooms and the hallways. And I think Ms. Autry made a comment at the last board meeting about, these phones in some ways are like an addiction, and you see that, right? It's no different than those of us that have kids. When you take your iPad from your 4-year-old, they just go crazy sometimes, right? It's a similar behavior when you try to take a cell phone from a teenager too, right? There's such that high degree of dependency on that device. And we know that, for example, Seattle Public Schools has recently filed a lawsuit against several companies in the social media space, alleging, among other things, that they've designed algorithms that target kids, right? I mean, so if we can remove a device that targets kids, from our schools, I think that's something that would have a huge impact almost immediately. So those are just some of my thoughts on it. And I think, Ms. Jackson, I think you were going to jump in.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree with everything that you said in regards to the cell phones, Dr. Hall, and I think it should be a priority. And I think looking over those options definitely to update our policy, because just in reviewing the policy, which is a good policy, to me, I feel like there are some gray areas, because we've dealt with instances where children have been removed from their school for things that they received on their phone outside of school hours. And when I looked at the policy, I was thinking, how did that happen? If they didn't have, we had the situation with the specific school. And I'm just curious, well, how does that happen? Because if I'm looking at the policy, it doesn't seem like that would have been clear if, in fact, the device was not in school, but it happened over the summer. I was sent something over the summer. So how did that then impact me having to choose another school? So things of that issue. Additionally, because cell phones are a problem, it seems that students are being triggered to stage fights and to capture misbehaviors because they get likes. And some students recently told me, which was very alarming, that there's a certain website that you upload fight footage to. And if you get so many views, it is monetized. So it puts more skin in the game for a student to catch acts of violence or to be a catalyst to make things happen if this, in fact, is a true statement. Now, I haven't researched this myself. This is just what was shared with me from some young people. Additionally, we recently received an email from a previous graduate of APS where he was mentioning certain technology that can be put in place. I don't know what the cost comparison would be, that will scram the signals, because in certain federal buildings, you cannot use your cell phone, becomes a moot. You can't do anything with it. The only thing I question with that, what about cameras? So I still like the idea. I'm interested to really talk about some solutions, because I do think we need to get back to the business of learning. And the cell phones are a great distraction to the learning environment in general. And so we need to deal with it, and we need to deal with it quick, fast. It's like snatching off a Band-Aid. I understand, the analogy about the toddlers and the addiction. And every house handles things differently, because that wasn't a problem for me as a parent. But every house handled things differently. I think now as an organization that we are realizing from what our teachers are saying, what our students have experienced, by way of bullying and by way of the embarrassment, which our policy does speak to, that I think some students will even have relief for a sound policy that is taking away a stress from teachers of not having to actually confront a child that may be enraged by this, but that makes it almost seamless, that it becomes a standard operating procedure. Yeah. So I say all that to say, yes, I'm in agreement that it needs to be added, that we need to visit some solutions. And whatever we do, I think it needs to be something, if possible, that can be done very swiftly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that, we can't drag our feet on this any longer than we already have, right? Something needs to have happened yesterday. right? I mean, and I think the one thing I was remiss in mentioning was that not only did we have some of our APS team members there, but we also had our AEA leadership, which also attended. I think Ms. Shipe also attended that session as well. And so we know that the AEA, our biggest partner, is in complete alignment and agreement with the administration, the board, that this is something that we have to be acting on immediately, right? We can't afford to wait, any longer than we already have, because every day it's a day of lost instruction. And those of us who walk through the schools and you see the state of some of these classrooms and some of these schools, it just really weighs on you, because you're like, all right, today is another day where learning was impacted because of cell phones. Today was another day where teachers had to be fearful of interactions with students around their phone. It was another day of that today. And then with regard to the policy component, though, as I said at the last board meeting, I think that we have to be thoughtful too, because there are probably legitimate reasons for why students should have a cell phone with them, right? I can think of medical conditions. There are apps on iPhones that, for students that would happen to have a cardiac arrhythmia, for example, the phone actually can act to monitor that kind of thing, right? So there are apps around diabetes control, right? So there are, I can imagine that there are legitimate purposes for why a student would need or want to have a cell phone from a medical standpoint, right? And so that's why, I kind of think about the military quite a bit. Dr. Akbar being a veteran and, I'm still serving, the military puts a policy in place, but then you can apply for what's called an exception to policy, right? And as long as you are, and if that exception to policy is granted, as long as you are acting in accordance with the exception that was granted you, you can keep on doing or reaping the benefits of the accommodation that was granted. However, if you violate that, then the exception to policy goes away, right? So I think that, so what I want to stay away from a policy standpoint is, and I don't think that we're even talking about doing this, but just have policy that, is a carte blanche, like nobody can have cell phones, that's it today, right? I think that as we're thinking about this other technology that our team members just saw last week, and we're thinking about sort of what we draft, it should be something that I think has an exception process. It should not be easy, because we should not have a policy where 900 out of every 1,000 kids can get an exception policy. But I think that becomes where the nuance is like what is the nature of the exceptions? And my sense is that it's a policy that's going to have to be one that can evolve over time, or at least we craft a language that does allow some latitude with regard to the exception process. But so I think that's going to be the single hardest part about it, is figuring out what, if any, exceptions to policy we would be granting, and what the basis for that would be. I think that becomes the real hard part of this. I think the board, superintendent, union, teachers, and I think there's largely alignment around the need to do something about it. But how we craft a policy and how we address exceptions, I think, becomes very challenging. So anyway, appreciate the time.
Yeah, I think that the discussion so far has been great and good. As we move down this road, I also don't want to move with such haste that we miss the opportunity to elevate the students' voices in this process. I think that this is a prime example where our student board members and our student ambassadors at our schools can be leading the way on this for us, because they are the beneficiaries of the policies that we make, specifically this one. And then I think they also may enlighten us on some exceptions that we may not think about. Because our families and students live in very different situations and have different needs that may determine what you're calling an exception process that may determine their need for it that won't be medical, right? So I also, yes, I am a veteran, so I'll say this, and I'll say this in love. Also want to make sure we don't move towards the military stance on policies. I don't think that at the end of the day, this is an educational institution, and which goes to my second point, which is, yes, we understand that there has been things that have not gone well with the use of cell phones in our schools, but there are great opportunities to use the cell phone for activities and exercises that can enhance learning. And I don't want to eliminate that opportunity for teachers who feel comfortable using it as a tool for learning instead of a distraction, for them to still have that opportunity to do so. The third thing and final thing is around discipline. What we don't want is more students being disciplined and sent out of school for cell phone use. I think as we think about any type of policy change, we also have to think about what happens if a person doesn't fulfill that policy. And I think that's another piece of it that we need to also attach to this discussion. I see Madam Superintendent had a question or a comment. I'm sorry.
No, I just, I really, really appreciate your last 3 points. And so in terms of incorporating student voice in this, because we need their buy-in and active engagement into what we ultimately do. Also, not forgetting that the devices are also small computers, so they are used for good in some areas where they are learning devices, and there are teachers who incorporate them. And so what that flexibility looks like and under what conditions will be really important. And then keeping in mind that overall impact for, we don't want to exasperate more, student discipline in that regard. So we need that heavy balance. And so just want to appreciate those points. The team is, we did pull out the policy. We've done close reads of it. We're engaging with both working collaboratively with the union, but also with building principals, things of that nature, to make sure that we have good, perspective, because we do feel like we need to act and act now. We feel like that there could be a place to pilot even a couple of different approaches, and to also see which approaches are getting the best results, still aligned to the board's policy. So we do actively have teams that are meeting to really discuss and understand against our policy now, which is pretty comprehensive, what is it that needs to be addressed that we're not getting the results that we want. And so we have groups meeting now. We do have plans in the works to engage with our student leaders to get student voice in there. So it's like, great minds think alike in that regard. So we will be prepared at the next board meeting to share some initial thoughts, and especially with helping you all know what the team who went to Dayton to observe the strategy being used there, what they saw, and how they think it fits with what we're doing here.
Thank you. Ms. Jackson?
Thank you, Superintendent. I just want to address this issue about the cell phones being used as a learning device, because I may be unclear, so I'm asking this question for clarity. Are we a district where each student is a one-on-one with a device such as a Chromebook or?
We do have the one-on-ones. We might, though, in a classroom environment, when you're doing like poll everywhere type things like that, where you're not going to have those apps that work off more of a desktop, it's more of a cell phone, those sorts of things. And, there are a variety of activities. So it's a both and. But yes, we are a one-to-one district. So
learning can still happen in the area of innovation and technology without cell phones.
Yeah, it's just, so it's the question is, are there ways in which for teachers who do design lessons that we could accommodate, their use, it's just, is it an all or nothing?
Right.
Yeah.
And I understand the all or nothing, and I'm in strong agreement as far as with student voices. But I must be honest here, is that when I look over this cell phone policy, it's such a strong policy. It's a policy that speaks to, if you record things, act of violence or inappropriate things, that there is immediate discipline action. We are at this place because although a well-drafted policy exists, that is not the reality in buildings. We are in a place that usually if you do something and it's against the law, if you break or violate policy, there's a consequence. That's life. So what we're doing is, it just sounds like to me, we see this as a problem. I want to be mindful that we are not making more of allowances and excuses that takes us back to the same place we are. Because when you read through this policy, it is a very strong, clear policy on how to address cell phones. There's nothing really wrong with the policy, except I mentioned the gray area about students being disciplined for things that are recorded outside of school hours. How does that then become school business? Because I don't feel that this policy speaks to that. Additionally, and I'm just processing this because I understand that there may be certain allowances needed. Dr. Akbar made mention of our students coming from varied backgrounds and different circumstances that may not be medically driven. And cell phones have not always existed. Medical conditions have always existed for young people. It's not a new phenomenon. Varied home situations have always existed. I think we need to be mindful, even when we're talking with the students, that if we establish a standard, that the standard and the expectation is the standard and the expectation, whatever that looks like. Because my question then becomes, if you have a student that have some medical challenges, and I understand, I think Dr. Hall, you addressed this, that is a problem. And then if you have multiple students with health issues that you've allowed to have cell phones or other situations, to your point, Dr. Akbar, in classrooms that then use their device and may be a distraction to learning, then what? When the parents then petition and agitate, or if they give the same resistance because it's been allowed. I'm just saying that if we're going to recreate a policy, the standard needs to be the standard, because nothing is new under the sun. We're not talking about something new other than the technology and the use of it in the classroom, and how screen time, we have plenty of research that shows too much time in front of these devices, whatever they are, phones, are a problem. If students are in a classroom, they need human interaction. And so if a class period is 45 minutes or 50 minutes, I don't think that as an educator, I don't want to spend a lot of time leaning on the use of technology. I want human interaction with the student, with the teacher in real time. And from an educational standpoint, I think that would be more beneficial, and that our outcomes would speak to that shift of engaging learners in real time, interacting with human interaction. So I just want to be mindful, because it seems as though when we're talking about this, it's like we're talking about changing it, but then it seems like it's some step back happening. And I could be misreading that, but if it's a policy, the law is the law. The policy is the policy. If you violate the policy, there's a consequence. And to your point, or someone's point about we don't want to uptick in discipline for the use of cell phones. But if we look at something that is in place, it makes that a moot point, because it will be no discipline because they won't have access to use the cell phone. Yeah. So.
Well, yeah.
So I appreciate those comments. The one thing I want to say, and I don't want this wasn't intended to be a full-fledged conversation, but I think it's important that we do have a balanced conversation about it. And so I agree with you, Ms. Jackson. After reading the policy multiple times, I do think that it is a strong policy and that it deserves some discussion on how to implement it and execute it, and maybe some minor changes or modifications to strengthen it. But I do agree that it is a strong policy. I wouldn't suggest us starting from scratch. But I also want to just say that this is 2023, and our classrooms have to continue to evolve, and it has to continue to innovate. And because our students of 2023 were almost born with some type of device in their hand, we also have to adapt our schools to understand the students that we are currently living in. When I was in school, probably when everyone around this table was in school, we did not have cell phones. And that's we are in a different day. And so we cannot, treat our students within the context of 2000. We have to treat them in the context of 2023. And so with that being said, I think that I appreciate the discussion. I think we, based off what I heard, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that this is a high priority that we will mark as a high priority for us, and we'll move forward with that discussion more immediately than later. Is that an accurate portrayal of this discussion? Okay, and I know we didn't talk about the priority for transportation. Is there, if we're looking at high, moderate, or low, is there any commentary on where that might land?
Well, I'd say for me, it probably lands a tick behind cell phones, just because the cell phone, I think, is more universal in its effects. But if you could have a 1 and a 1A, I mean, they're both pretty significant. So I'd probably give if I had to, give one the edge, I'd give the cell phone policy a slight edge. But I think, but as much as we discuss equity, to not be addressing the transportation with regard to Miller South and specialty schools, I think that's a huge miss for us. So.
Okay, so we have multiple things in the high quadrant, so that works. I'm sorry, Madam Superintendent, do you have something? Oh, okay.
No, I was going to suggest it more a medium, just because I think it's going to fit in too with the LTOP discussion as well. There are transportation implications. I think originally when transportation was discussed as well, and I just can't remember verbatim, but that Deborah Folk also wanted us to look at some aspect of transportation in terms of evening out. Our transportation services right now has just grown to what it is today, and we've just been responding and adding. And so there is also some perspective that she and the transportation department, which she oversees, might also bring some recommendations to the board.
I think that would be good. And the transportation policy was one of the ones that I know that the district was still looking at, that we had a first reading on already. So now the next one is emotional support animals. We've gotten, well, I should say, I don't know if all of us have gotten it, but I've gotten, so we've gotten multiple kind of emails about emotional support animals. Currently, our policy around animals is they're prohibited unless they're a service animal. I think that's, so we would need to re-examine that policy to add emotional support animals and figure out in what ways or nuances we would want to allow or disallow that within our school buildings. And so is there any, before we talk about where we would rate it, is there any discussion on that one?
Yeah,
Dr. Hall?
Yeah, I've got a couple of comments. So I think the point's been made already tonight that this is 2023 and that we have to continue to evolve in how we think. I think Dr. Akbar made that point. And I think we've evolved to the point where we have a greater number of students that have social, emotional concerns. And that's for any number of reasons, right? Society, I think, continues to create that. I think we're also doing a better job of diagnosing and recognizing it now, right? And we just, and it's, and it's a fact that there are some students, some children, young adults even, right, that benefit from having an emotional support animal around, right? There's a reason why you see them in hospitals, you see them in senior living centers, you see them in daycare centers. You do see them in some schools, not our schools. And so to me, if we're really being serious about how we're going to address social emotional needs and concerns for our students, I think we have to consider that that would be a type of, I don't want to say solution, but a type of intervention that may have a positive impact on certain students, that are maybe not reachable by other methods. So I do think that, and some of the things I've heard that have been brought up with regard to some of the reasons why it's not a good idea, again, I don't have an exhaustive list in front of me, but, I know that we were at the science fair on Saturday, and we had some staff members that were talking about some things that's been told to them as to where does an animal go to the bathroom at, and things like that. What happens if an animal has an accident? Well, these are the same concerns, questions you would have with a service animal, right? I mean, service animals are not perfect either in their ability to control themselves from a bladder or standpoint, right? So, I just think that we've got to. It is 2023, and I think that we've got to be as creative as possible. No one is suggesting that we bring hundreds of animals to schools across Akron, but I do think that there's a time and a place for that kind of intervention.
Thank you. Madam Superintendent?
Just as clarification, we do have instances in our schools where there are service animals, and so if we could start with, here's the process that's in place now to consider and approve or not. But we do have instances. I think you've seen several times, even our one staff member that comes with the color guard from Buchtel, who has her service animal with her often that's in the schools. But we do have those instances out in the schools as well.
I think we're conflating two concepts.
Yeah.
So I think we're conflating a service animal and an emotional support animal.
Okay.
So those are not the same thing. And so I would concur with the superintendent that we do have service animals, but again, I think what we're talking about here is the emotional support animals.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Hers
yeah.
is for emotional support, but maybe I just need to understand the nuance of what we do. So no problem.
Yeah. So the current policy, and I only know this because I reviewed it after the several emails about it, and seeing certain people at certain events, they also ask about it, which I actually think is a good thing. So just point of personal privilege, I used to be against animals and dogs in learning environments for emotional support. And we where I work, we didn't have it until like maybe 2019, and I've seen the difference it's made in some students having emotional support animals, which is different than service animals. So service animal typically has to go through a certain type of training, and also typically is for a medical purpose. Emotional support is different, and our current policy only speaks to service animals. So that's the reason why maybe we should revisit that policy and see how we can add emotional support if that's something we want to do. Any other discussion? If not, we can see where we want to rate it. Okay, so do we think this is a high, moderate, or low priority for the year?
I think it's low for me.
Okay.
I would say low.
Okay.
But I do want to say, and someone can help me with this. In my first class, when I came, I was just sworn in January, and so my first cluster was Kenmore Garfield, and I make a priority to visit all the schools in my cluster. So I don't know which school it was. And if someone's watching this, I hope they can chime in, or maybe not, because now I'm thinking it may be a problem. But I feel like I went to a school that had an emotional support animal, because I was like, but it was really nice, and they told me it wasn't out broad. It was like the students could come in, they need a break, and they would just they could just rub the animal, and then they would go back to class, and they were telling me how impactful this was. And they were it was like not a guest, but maybe someone that comes into the school in some type of capacity. But I'm sorry because I don't want to quote it, and I intentionally probably, if I remember, wouldn't want to quote it because now I'm thinking after you said that policy. But they were very happy and pleased. It seemed like it worked very well for them, but it was a structure in place, and I just can't recall the school. So that may be something like just to consider. It wasn't that it was out or everyone was carrying in this emotional support area, but it was like, animal. But it was like if Dr. Akbar's office, if you need a break or you want to touch the animal and for emotional support, whatever that, it was something, it might have been a dog or something, but it was something where the kids could just, I don't know, they were able to rub it or something. So I'm going to stop talking, but someone knows what I'm talking about. Somewhere in the district there was something.
So one of the concerns that was brought to me was that if you're in a certain building with a certain principle, with a certain philosophy, that they may allow it. But currently, again, after the conversations, I went to policy because I think that's what we should do. And policy does not mention emotional support at all and only make allowances for service animals. So in my due diligence for this body is to say, okay, this concern was brought to me and it has come up multiple times. So can we take a look at the policy so that it's not dependent on the philosophy of a staff member, and that we not only have a policy, but then there's administrative guidelines that are attached to that policy that helps facilitate a standardized process so that we do get a process where it's acceptable to the district and to our community. So
yeah,
that
so you know it exists.
What?
You said some people said it's certain.
I was told that I wasn't told which school, but I was told
good.
that
okay, good. So
it exists
world,
somewhere.
I'm not crazy. I don't know what school I went to, but yes.
I haven't seen it myself, but I was told that it exists somewhere. So that was the purpose. So you said low priority, Dr. Hall. Oh, low or moderate? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, for now, I would say moderate, right? I mean, if we were to add 10 more policies to the list, I might bump it to low. But I think part of this, too, I think the challenging part is, at least in my head, is I think about the number of students that it impacts, right? I mean, so some policies maybe impact a fewer number of students and faculty than others, right? So part of my criteria as whether or not it goes to moderate or high is the number of students that it would impact potentially. So using that as the rubric, then maybe low is the answer, Ms. Jackson, to your point. But then I also think about the students that right now that are in our schools that maybe are having challenges that only are going to be partially assuaged by the utilization of a service animal. And so that's what in my head makes me bump it to moderate is the intensity component. So those are just my thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. And only because I am an equity person, true and true, I do want to just mention that the lower quantity doesn't dictate lower necessity of need or urgency. So there might be, let's say, 10% of the district that will benefit, but the greater impact that could have on that 10% could totally rise the district's achievement levels. So we also need to look at the impact that it has, even if it's a smaller number, the intensity of that impact on that small number as well. Because that's how you get inequities, when you focus just on the denominator and not those individuals that can really truly make a shift by having that type of intervention. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that because I wouldn't be true to myself and my code of ethics, as we call them in our field. So
one quick point of clarification too. I know so service animals, I think we think of them typically for folks who may be visually impaired or challenged. But as Dr. Akbar can attest to as well, there are a number of former service members who use service dogs because they have some sort of PTSD. And so I believe the person we're talking about in your example, Madam Superintendent, I think that particular faculty member, I think that's a service animal that's she has in part because of PTSD. So would fit the definition of a service animal, not emotional support in her case. So either way, it's we can get clarity around that, but I just want to share that too.
Yeah, I'm not sure, and I don't want to go into anybody's medical history, but my whole thought about this conversation is expanding what we provide as a district as acceptable and unacceptable, and then how that process pans out to work itself out to support the people that we are the custodians of their well-being and for part of their day is how we do that. That's kind of my thought process. So it sounds like emotional support animals and that policy would be more moderate potentially. Are there any other policies we want to look at that? Again, these are just 3 that I came up with in talking to Todd and Diana earlier in the week, but that was last week. So last week that we wanted to bring forward. So there could be others.
Yeah, I've got one actually. Our cash reserve policy is one that I'd like us to take up as well. So as we, not to get too far in the weeds here, but this was something that came up during our negotiations, right? When we were quantifying our district's ability to afford or not afford different things, and so the current state of our cash reserve policy is one that I don't think is realistic, and I think as we're trying to move into the 21st century and and be more fiscally responsible. And also thinking through how we project and plan, whether from a financial or levy standpoint. I think we have to also have a cash reserve policy that is consistent with that in principle. And I don't believe that we currently do. So that's something I'd like us to take up, and I think that for me is a high priority item. So
yeah. So what I would suggest based off that is if we want to look at the policy and give some recommendations potentially, we can send it to the Finance and Capital Management Committee to make some final kind of recommendations to come back to us, or we can make that as a recommendation for the Finance and Capital Management Committee to look at and then put over to us once they look at it first. So we have 2 different ways we can do it, but I think that because that policy also originated in the Finance and Capital Management Committee, we should also send it back there before we do any final recommendations to the full board.
yeah, I agree.
So, okay. So maybe between now and our next meeting, we'll decide which one of those processes we want to follow and work with Ms. Autry and committee. I also sit on that committee with Mr. Perry, I believe, about when they can put that into their plans as well. Any other policies we want to look at? Okay. So we will, at least with the 4 that we have now, we will begin to spec those out for the year.
What about
go ahead.
I'm sorry, what about student grievance? Like the process, the steps for student superintendent, you may can speak better to this. Like for student grievances, if a student is having an issue building, it's taken to the principal. Because I know I've received emails from students, as you all may have, and although it's great for us to be informed, so because we are their community representative to some degree, right? But we are not the step. So how can we put something clearly in place? We have student board members. How can we activate a system
that they know that this is the natural progression. If you are in the building, you first step, if you try to approach, if it's with a teacher or if it's with other children, you go to the building principal. If you have no response to the if you're not receiving any feedback, whatever, or you're discontented.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. If you'll allow us to, me to take a look, because I want to make sure I'm speaking accurately about what our student rights and responsibilities are. So on the right side, kind of how that plays itself out. And there's a great deal of work being done. Even nationally, you're hearing about even parents' bills of rights, things of that nature. So there's a lot of draft potential policy out there that's really thinking through how do we get clearer about persons' rights within an educational environment. So we're also watching that closely and can begin to share some of that information with the board. So homework, we're going to do some homework on that, yeah.
So what I think I heard is potentially adding student bill of rights as something for us to look into. And maybe we can, I don't know if we want to rate that now or we want to wait until the next meeting and get more information. What's the thought?
I'd like to get a little more information first.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Any other policies? Now, I know there's other policies that even Madam Superintendent mentioned from the Neola review, and I don't know if anyone wants to chime in on that, but those will get filtered into the process. I don't know if we have a comprehensive list of which ones will likely come to us, and then we can do the rating for those as well.
I'm not clear on the order, like if we're taking the whole student section before it's administrative, kind of process, but we can find that out and get that to you so that you can better anticipate, kind of what are those batch orders. Right now, it was just the more frequent updates versus us stepping back to and looking at kind of those sections, because in addition to the updates that Neola is pushing out, I think what we found is that the review of some of our normal policies are a little behind, that we need to get caught up. So we can offer that to you at the next meeting. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh, that's okay. I just wanted to share that our Neola rep, he's going to start, when he does an overview for the policy updates, he's going to start categorizing them, like which ones are mandatory, which are recommended, and which are school choice. So that should be a little helpful.
That'd be great. And Ms. Moika, once we receive that, if the committee could get that as well, so we could see what they're thinking about, because the district choice ones may also give us an opportunity to look at which ones we want to implement. And I know I was talking to Diana, Ms. Fido, whenever it was, that some of the district choice ones over the years end up becoming mandatory. And so it might behoove us to look at them while they're optional and start to make them work for our district before they become mandatory. And I don't know if you have anything else to say about that, Ms. Fido.
No, nothing in particular. I think part of the issue too is sometimes what happens is there'll be a district choice. Akron will create the policy. There'll be district choice updates to that policy. Akron will elect not to update those policies. Then all of a sudden there's a mandatory update. And then what our policy looks like is very different from what the mandatory policy that Neola releases, because we didn't go back and do some of those optional updates. So it requires a look back and reworking to bring it completely up to date. Not that it's improper the way it is now. It's just hard then to compare an existing policy with what Neola is now recommending, if that makes sense. So it's working through all those kinks, if you will, to make sure that we then have the most updated version.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, and I think that now that we're working with Neola, more directly and concertedly, it might be good to start kind of a registry of, even when we get those district choice ones, if we decide to not move forward with it, we can at least have a registry of what that recommendation was in what year and continue to move forward. So when we get the third or fourth iteration of it and then become mandatory, we at least have a record of what that conversation was like and why we chose not to do what and when. So I think that will help with that discussion. Anything else? Any other policies? We don't have anything else to review or follow up on as far as I know. So yes, Madam Superintendent. One
other one that we might want to watch a bit, and that's the athletics. The Athletic Advisory Committee I met with last week, and I know they've been looking at their eligibility policies and, and how it relates to capturing students when they can play, things of that nature. So one of the things I advised them of is that as they were making recommendations, they were going to take those recommendations because it fits a lot with the instructional policy, the instructional decisions of eligibility, but that it also would come through this committee as well. So we can put those dates, kind of those target dates that they have out there on your radar as well. But looking at athletics and athletic eligibility could be one of those topics that.
Okay, thank you. I think we could put that down as number 6, and maybe another one that we seek further information before we put it on the calendar. Okay. Anything else? All right. Hearing and seeing none, I guess we can adjourn at 6:49. I hope that everyone have a great rest of their Monday and great week as we roll into Black History Month. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you for those who are joining us online.